A humble boy surprises everyone by asking for the balance of a forgotten account left by his grandfather. What begins as a source of mockery soon turns to tension as the system reveals secrets that many wanted to keep buried. Secret documents, a blocked inheritance, and a web of corruption come to light. And in this boy's hands lies the key to a legacy. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll hear in your life. Tuesday morning began differently in Ethan's life. The 11-year-old boy woke up with a knot in his stomach that he couldn't explain, as if destiny were about to show him a side of itself he had yet to meet. Through the window of the simple apartment in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago, he watched the gray sky, typical of August, while his mother, Sarah, finished arranging documents in a plastic folder worn by time. Sarah was 34, but she seemed to carry on her shoulders the weight of a lifetime of sacrifices. Her brown eyes, which once shone with dreams and hopes, now reflected only exhaustion and determination. She worked as a housekeeper in 3 different homes, waking up before sunrise and returning home when the moon was already reigning in the sky. But that morning, she had asked for the day off from all her jobs. What she needed to do was too important to be postponed. "Ethan, are you ready, my son?" Her voice sounded firm, but he could perceive a subtle tremor, as if Sarah were mustering all her courage to face something bigger than both of them. The boy wore the only pair of dress pants he owned, a bit short at the ankles because he had grown so fast in the last year, and a white shirt his mother had ironed so carefully it looked new, though it had seen better days. He nodded, picking up the school backpack he carried, even though it wasn't a school day. Inside, besides his notebooks, was a small metal box that had belonged to his grandfather, Arthur, a man Ethan had barely had time to know, but whose stories echoed like legends in the family's memory. Professor Arthur had been a man of unshakable principles. He taught economics at the University of Chicago and was known not only for his profound knowledge of the subject, but for his courage to question what he considered unjust. Sarah always told her son that his grandfather was the kind of person who didn't look away in the face of injustice, even when it cost him dearly. And it did. In the last years of his life, the professor had become involved in exposing the suspicious financial practices of a powerful corporate group, and this brought him enemies he never imagined he would have. When the professor passed away 3 years ago, he left behind not only longing but also mysteries. Sarah remembered the day of the funeral, when an elderly lawyer named Walter appeared at their home with a sealed letter and precise instructions. When Ethan turned 11, he should go to the Continental Trust Bank in downtown Chicago and request access to an account in his name. Nothing more was said. No further explanation. Just the certainty that something was waiting for them, something Professor Arthur had planned with care. And there they were, on that cool August morning, ready to discover what fate and his grandfather had in store for them. The journey to the city center was long and silent. Mother and son took 2 crowded buses, squeezing in between hurried workers and sleepy students. Ethan watched through the window as the city moved frantically, each person caught in their own race against time. With no idea of the stories others carried with them, he thought of his grandfather trying to reconstruct in his memory the face of the man he had seen only a few times, when he was very young. He remembered the smell of coffee and old books that always accompanied Professor Arthur, his deep and calm voice, the gold-rimmed glasses he wore hanging from his neck on a thin chain. Sarah, for her part, was fighting an internal battle. Part of her was hopeful, believing that perhaps her father had left some resource that could help her give her son a better life. But another part, the more rational one, prepared for disappointment. After all, Professor Arthur had always lived modestly on his professor's salary and nothing more. What could be in a bank account that would justify all this mystery? When they got off the second bus at Daly Plaza, the contrast between the world they came from and the world they were entering became painfully evident. The Continental Trust Bank rose imposingly on LaSalle Street, a building of glass and marble that seemed to scream opulence and power. The mirrored facade reflected the cloudy sky, creating an illusion that the building touched the clouds. Well-dressed people constantly entered and exited, all with that characteristic hurry of those who have a lot of money and little time. Ethan held his mother's hand tighter as they passed through the revolving doors. The interior of the bank was even more intimidating than the exterior. The polished marble floor reflected the lights of the crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling. There were leather armchairs, impeccable ornamental plants, and in the back, a long counter where employees served clients with professional and discreet smiles. It was impossible not to notice the stairs. As soon as they entered, Ethan felt the weight of silent judgments. The security guards followed them. With their eyes, clients averted their gaze with a mix of indifference and discomfort, and the employees at the counter exchanged whispers as they watched them. Sarah and Ethan's simple appearance, their humble clothes, and the posture of those who didn't belong in that environment marked them as intruders in this temple of money. Sarah took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and walked with dignity to the nearest counter. A blonde employee in an impeccable uniform and perfect makeup looked up with an expression that mixed boredom and disdain. "Good morning, may I help you?" The voice was cold, professional to the extreme, but carried a clear subtext. "You shouldn't be here." "Good morning." Sarah's voice came out firmer than she expected. "My son needs to check the balance of an account that is in his name." The employee arched a perfectly drawn eyebrow. "An account? In a child's name?" Ethan stepped forward, surprising himself with the courage he found somewhere inside his chest. "It's not an ordinary account. It's an account left by my grandfather, Professor Arthur Davies. He was an economist and a professor at the University of Chicago." Upon mentioning his grandfather's full name, something in the air changed. The employee, who until then had barely hidden her disinterest, blinked a few times and her face lost some of its color. She exchanged a quick glance with a colleague at the next counter, a middle-aged man who also seemed to recognize the name. "Please wait a moment." The coldness in her voice had been replaced by something close to caution. She picked up the internal phone and made a brief call, speaking too quietly for them to hear. Sarah and Ethan were led to a waiting room. It was not a common room for clients, but an environment clearly intended for special situations. There were only 4 chairs, a coffee table with magazines on economics and business, and an abstract painting on the wall that conveyed nothing but pretension. The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving mother and son alone with their expectations and anxieties. "Mom." "What's happening?" Ethan whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and excitement. Sarah held her son's hand and squeezed it gently. "I don't know, my love, but your grandfather was a very wise man. He wouldn't have done something like this without an important reason." On the other side of the door, in the heart of the bank, a discreet but intense commotion was beginning. The counter employee, whose name was Patricia, was meeting with the branch manager, Henry Thompson, a 52-year-old man with perfectly coiffed grey hair and a suit that cost more than Sarah earned in 6 months. "Mr. Thompson, the system flagged a special class account. It's been locked for years and is linked to that boy's name. The last name is Davies. Arthur Davies." Henry felt a knot in his stomach upon hearing that name. He had been at the bank for 25 years and knew the story of Professor Arthur well, knew it perhaps better than he would have liked. The professor had been a client of Continental for decades, but in the last years of his life he had become a kind of silent enemy of the institution. He had questioned transactions, requested audits, and had even mentioned irregularities involving important people. And then, suddenly, the professor had ceased his public activities and withdrawn. A few months later, the news that he was no longer among them reached the bank discreetly, almost as a relief to some. But now, 3 years later, that name was back, and it brought a boy with it. Henry picked up the phone. He needed to make a call, but he hesitated. He looked at Patricia and ordered, "Keep them in the waiting room. Don't let anyone speak to them until I get back, and don't mention this to anyone else, understood?" Patricia nodded and left quickly. Henry closed his office door, drew the blinds, and dialed a number that was not in his official directory. On the other end of the line, a deep voice answered after the second ring. "He's here, the professor's grandson. Were you expecting this?" The voice on the other end paused. "Yes?" Keep them there. I'll send someone. And Henry, do not let them access anything until we are sure how to proceed. There are interests at stake." Henry hung up and felt a cold sweat run down his neck. He knew that by attending to this family, he was opening a door that should have remained closed. But there was no choice. The boy had legal rights, and an account in his name could not simply be ignored. However, what that account contained was the real question. What if it was something Professor Arthur had saved? What if it was documents, evidence, recordings? While Henry dealt with his own concerns, on another floor of the same building, a 23-year-old named Leo Morgan was observing everything through a glass window. Leo was an intern in the records department, hired just 2 months prior, full of ideals and a genuine desire to build an honest career in the financial system. He was organizing old documents when he overheard the conversation of 2 older employees in the hallway. "Did you see Professor Arthur's name popped up in the system? That professor? The one who exposed that scheme years ago?" "The very same. It seems his grandson is here." Leo felt a chill. He knew the story of Professor Arthur, not personally, but through old articles and reports he had read during his economics studies. The professor was considered an academic hero, someone who had stood up against questionable financial practices at a time when that could cost a great deal. There were rumors that he had gathered evidence against a money laundering scheme involving major businessmen and even members of the banking system. But the evidence never surfaced, and the case died. With the professor. What if the evidence was here in this bank waiting to be discovered? Leo made an impulsive decision. He returned to his computer and began searching the digital archives for anything related to the name Arthur Davies. The system was old and complex, but he had learned to navigate it in recent weeks. It took a few minutes, but he finally found it. A special class account, locked since the date of the professor's death, with access restricted to only one holder, and the holder was a child, Ethan Davies, born in 2014. Leo wrote down the account number and continued searching. There was something else, a record of a safe deposit box, a physical box located in the bank's sub-basement, maximum security sector, and access to this box had a specific condition. It could only be opened when the holder turned 11 years old and presented specific documentation. The young intern felt he had stumbled upon something much bigger than a simple inheritance case. He had to decide what to do with this information. Should he simply pretend he saw nothing and continue with his routine work? Or should he try to help this boy and his mother, even if it could cost him his career before it even began? In the waiting room, Ethan was starting to get restless. It had been almost an hour since they had been left there. Sarah tried to stay calm, distractedly flipping through the magazines, but her nervousness was visible in the way her hands trembled slightly. The door finally opened, and Henry Thompson entered with a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning. I'm very sorry for the wait. My name is Henry Thompson. I'm the manager of this branch. I apologize for the inconvenience, but we needed to verify some internal procedures before proceeding." Sarah stood up, maintaining her dignified posture. "No problem. We're willing to wait as long as necessary. But I would like to understand what is happening. My son has documents proving there is an account in his name left by his grandfather. We just want to know what it's about." Henry nodded, but his gaze was fixed on Ethan. The boy, despite his young age, had the same intensity in his eyes that he remembered seeing in Professor Arthur. It was as if the old professor were there, looking through his grandson, reminding the manager of things best forgotten. "I understand perfectly. We just need to confirm a few details and prepare the proper documentation. Does young Ethan have his personal documents?" Sarah opened the plastic folder and took out a birth certificate, an ID, and a notarized document that had been left by the lawyer Walter 3 years prior. Henry took the papers with hands that tried not to shake and examined each one with exaggerated attention, as if looking for a flaw, a reason to deny access. But everything was in order. Perfectly. In order. As if Professor Arthur had foreseen every possible obstacle and prepared every detail with surgical precision. "Everything is correct, but I will need a few more minutes to prepare access to the system. Please wait here. Can I offer you coffee or water while you wait?" Sarah politely declined, and Henry left the room, closing the door behind him. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall for a moment, trying to control his breathing. This was getting out of hand. He picked up the phone again and made another call, this time more desperate. "They have everything. Complete documentation. I can't deny access. What do I do?" The voice on the other end replied with calculated coldness. "Give them access to the checking account. Show them the balance. But do not mention the safe deposit box. Not yet. I need time to prepare things." "But he has the right to the box. It's in the documentation." "Find an excuse. Technical problems, maintenance, anything. I just need 24 hours. Henry hung up, feeling like he was being pulled into something that could destroy not only his career, but his life. He had always known that working at that bank meant turning a blind eye to certain things, but he never imagined he would be put in such a direct position of obstructing justice. Meanwhile, in the bank's sub-basement, a security guard named Celia, a 60-year-old woman who had worked there for over 30 years, was making her rounds through the corridors leading to the vaults. She had heard Professor Arthur's name mentioned on the internal communication radio and felt a pang in her heart. She had known the professor personally, back when he still frequented the bank regularly. He was one of the few clients who treated her with genuine respect, who asked about her family, who remembered her name. Celia remembered the day the professor had sought her out, months before he passed away. He was different, thinner, with a tired but determined look in his eyes. He had asked her for a favor. If a boy ever appeared there looking for a safe deposit box in his name, she should ensure the boy was granted access, no matter what happened. At the time, Celia didn't fully understand, but she promised, and she was a woman of her word. Now, hearing that the professor's grandson was there, she knew the time had come to fulfill that promise. Back on the main floor, Ethan watched his mother with concern. Sarah tried to maintain her composure, but he could see the weariness in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. He wanted to say something to make her feel better, but he couldn't find the right words. "Mum, we don't have to do this if you don't want to. We can leave." Sarah looked at her son and smiled, a sad but loving smile. "No, my son. We've come this far. Your grandfather wanted you to be here today. There must be an important reason. We'll find out together, okay?" Ethan nodded and looked back at the door, waiting for it to open and finally reveal what fate and his grandfather Arthur had prepared for him. He didn't know it yet, but that day would change not only his life but the lives of many others, because some secrets, when they finally come to light, have the power to transform everything. The door to the waiting room finally opened again, and this time it wasn't just Henry who entered. Accompanying him was a woman of about 40, wearing an impeccable grey suit and carrying a leather briefcase that seemed to weigh more for what it represented than what it contained. Her black hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her blue eyes analyzed Sarah and Ethan with the precision of someone accustomed to assessing people and situations in seconds. "Good morning. My name is Victoria Evans. I'm from the legal department of Continental Trust Bank. Mr. Thompson informed me of the situation, and I came personally to ensure that everything is handled according to proper legal procedures." Sarah immediately sensed that something was wrong. The presence of a lawyer for simple access to a bank account seemed disproportionate, but she maintained her firm posture and replied politely. "Good morning, Ms. Evans. I see no reason for complications. My son has all the necessary documentation." Victoria smiled, but it was a calculated, warmthless smile. "Certainly. We just need to verify a few technical details. Special accounts, like the one Professor Arthur left, require specific access protocols. It's for everyone's benefit, including young Ethan's. We want to ensure his rights are fully respected." The words sounded reasonable, but the tone carried something Sarah couldn't quite identify. It was as if each sentence had a hidden second meaning, a layer of unspoken intentions. Ethan, for his part, watched the lawyer attentively. Even at 11, he had the intuition that some children develop when they grow up observing the world more closely than they should, and his intuition told him that this woman was not there to help them. Henry cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Well, if you'll follow me to my office, we can check the account balance and discuss the next steps. They followed him down the hall, and Ethan noticed how everyone stopped what they were doing to watch them pass. Employees pretended to be busy with papers while their eyes followed the small group. It was as if everyone knew something that mother and son did not, as if they were watching a play whose ending they already knew. Henry's office was large and decorated with conservative good taste. There was a mahogany desk, shelves filled with books that looked like they had never been opened, and pictures on the wall showing awards and certificates. He indicated 2 chairs in front of the desk and sat down, with Victoria strategically positioning herself beside him like a chess piece ready for the right move. Henry typed something into the computer, his expression growing more tense as the data appeared on the screen. He cleared his throat again, a nervous tick that seemed to intensify with each passing minute. Well, Mr. Ethan, the account exists and is active. Your grandfather, Professor Arthur, made regular deposits over the years and also transferred significant amounts shortly before he left us. How much? Ethan's question came out direct, without preamble, surprising the adults present. Henry looked at Victoria, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. The current balance, considering interest and adjustments, is approximately $2.8 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah felt as if the floor had disappeared from under her feet. $2.8 million. It was a figure she couldn't even imagine, a sum that could completely change their lives, or complicate them in ways she couldn't yet foresee. Ethan, on the other hand, remained surprisingly calm. How did my grandfather save so much money? He was just a professor. Henry consulted the screen again. According to the records, besides his salary as a professor, your grandfather did economic consulting for some companies and invested very intelligently. He was an extremely careful man with money. But there's something else. Victoria quickly interrupted. What Mr. Thompson means is that there are some legal matters to be resolved before the funds can be released. A sum of this magnitude left to a minor requires judicial approval, the appointment of a financial guardian, and a series of other procedures. Sarah felt anger begin to boil inside her. Procedures. It was always that. Procedures that served to delay, to complicate, to keep simple people away from what was rightfully theirs. My father left this for my son. We have all the documentation. What else do you need? Victoria maintained her professional tone, but there was a gleam in her eyes that revealed satisfaction in having control of the situation. Mrs. Davies, I understand your frustration, but these are the laws that protect the interests of the minor. We can't simply hand over a fortune to an 11-year-old child. It would be irresponsible. I am his mother. I am the one who should decide what is best for my son. Naturally. And that is precisely why we need to begin the proper legal process. In the meantime, the account will remain frozen. Ethan, who had remained quiet during the discussion, finally spoke, and his voice had a firmness that surprised everyone in the room. And the safe deposit box. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was a silence heavy with tension, as if Ethan had touched on something that was meant to remain hidden. What safe deposit box? Victoria asked, but her tone indicated she knew exactly what the boy was talking about. Ethan opened his backpack and took out the small metal box that had belonged to his grandfather. From inside he pulled out a small but ornate golden key with intricate engravings. In the documentation the lawyer gave us, it says there is a safe deposit box registered at this bank in my grandfather's name, and that access to it should be granted when I turned 11. I turned 11 2 weeks ago. Henry turned pale. Victoria, however, quickly recovered from her surprise. Well, safe deposit boxes are another matter entirely. We need to verify if such a box actually exists, if the documentation is in order, if... The documentation is in order. The voice that interrupted Victoria came from the office door where an elderly thin man with thin-rimmed glasses had just entered unannounced. His suit was old but well kept, and he carried a worn leather briefcase that seemed to have traveled through decades. Good morning. My name is Walter Hayes, attorney for Professor Arthur Davies. I believe you were expecting me. Henry stood up, clearly uncomfortable. Mr. Hayes, we didn't know you were coming today. You didn't? How strange. I sent a registered letter 3 weeks ago stating that I would be present on the date of Ethan's 11th birthday. The letter was received and signed for by this branch. Sarah recognized the lawyer. It was he who had appeared on the day of her father-in-law's funeral with the mysterious instructions. At the time, she had found him somewhat eccentric, but now she realized there was something calculated in his every action. Professor Arthur had chosen his legal representative well. Mr. Hayes opened his briefcase and began to remove documents. I have here the power of attorney Professor Arthur granted me while he was alive. I have the will registered with the court. I have the specific instructions regarding the safe deposit box and its contents, and I also have a court order, obtained 6 months ago, which stipulates that Continental Trust Bank must allow Ethan Davies access to special safe deposit box number 342, located in the sub-basement of this institution on or after his 11th birthday. Victoria took the documents and examined them carefully, looking for a loophole, a flaw, but there was nothing. Every paper was perfect, every stamp in its place, every signature notarized and recognized. Professor Arthur had prepared everything years in advance, as if he knew exactly what obstacles would be placed in his grandson's path. The documents are in order, Victoria admitted, but her tone made it clear she was not happy about it. However, the access hours for the safe deposit boxes have already closed for today. You will have to return tomorrow. Mr. Hayes smiled. I consulted the bank's internal regulations. Access to the safe deposit boxes can be granted during extended hours upon judicial request, and I have exactly that right here. He placed another document on the desk. Immediate access, with no possibility of postponement, under penalty of a daily fine of $50,000. Henry looked at Victoria, who in turn took out her cell phone and stepped away to make a call. Ethan watched everything with growing attention, realizing that there was much more at stake than simply opening a safe deposit box. A battle was taking place, a silent battle where every word and every document was a weapon. Sarah held her son's hand and whispered, "Your grandfather must have foreseen all of this." Victoria returned, her expression that of someone who had lost a battle but still planned to win the war. "Very well. We will proceed with access to the safe deposit box, but I will need to accompany you, as will a representative from the bank's security, to ensure everything is properly documented." Mr. Hayes nodded. Naturally, transparency is always welcome. The group descended in the elevators to the bank's sub-basement. The atmosphere there was completely different from the ostentatious luxury of the upper floors. The corridors were narrow, lit by fluorescent lamps that hummed softly. The walls were grey-painted concrete, and there were reinforced metal doors at regular intervals, each with visible security systems. Celia, the veteran security guard, was waiting at the entrance to the safe deposit box area. When she saw Ethan, her eyes filled with tears that she tried to hide. "Good morning. I was a friend of your grandfather. He was a great man." Ethan smiled shyly. "Thank you." Celia looked at Henry and Victoria. "I've come to prepare access to safe deposit box 342, as requested." They passed through 2 more security doors, each requiring different codes and biometric checks. Finally, they reached a large room with entire walls covered in small metal doors, each with a number. Celia walked to the back of the room and stopped before a door larger than the others, in an isolated position. "This is a special box. There are only 3 of them in this bank, reserved for clients with specific security needs." She inserted a master key and then turned to Ethan. "Now I need your key." Ethan took the golden key from his pocket and handed it to Celia. She inserted it into the second lock and turned. There was a deep mechanical click, and then the door swung open slowly, revealing a compartment the size of a small locker. Inside was a grey metal box, simple but sturdy. Celia carefully removed it and placed it on a table in the center of the room. "Take your time. I'll be right outside if you need me." When the door closed behind Celia, Ethan looked at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. He approached the box and noticed an envelope taped to the lid, with his name handwritten in his grandfather's script. With trembling fingers, He opened the envelope and began to read. His voice wavered at first, but gained strength as he read on. My dear Ethan, if you are reading this, it means you have become a young man. 11 is an important age, an age when we begin to understand that the world is not as simple as it seems. You are probably confused, perhaps even scared, but I want you to know that everything I did was with you and your future in mind. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. It was like hearing her father's voice again, even through the words read by her grandson. Inside this box, you will find things that may seem strange now, but will make sense over time. You will also find the truth about who I was and what I stood for. The truth is not always easy, my grandson, but it is always necessary. There are people who do not want this truth to come to light, powerful people who have benefited from silence, but I trust that you, with the help of your mother and the good people who still exist in the world, will know what to do. Ethan paused, swallowing hard before continuing. Do not let the money change who you are. It is only a tool, a means to do good or evil. The choice is yours, and remember, the greatest inheritance I can leave you is not the figures in an account, but the values in your soul. Always be honest, always be fair, always be brave, and when you have doubts, ask yourself what your old grandfather would do. The letter ended there, signed simply with, Your loving grandfather, Arthur. There was a moment of respectful silence. Then, carefully, Ethan opened the box. Inside were several items meticulously organized. On top, a flash drive in a clear plastic case with a label that read, To be viewed first. Below it, organized folders with documents, copies of contracts, highlighted bank transactions, underlined names, and at the bottom, another thicker envelope, sealed with wax. Mr. Hayes approached. With your permission, Ethan, I must inform you that your grandfather instructed me about the contents of this box. The flash drive contains a video he recorded months before he passed away. He would like you to watch it now, with your mother by your side. Victoria stepped forward. I believe the contents of this box should first be analyzed by legal professionals. There could be implications. Mr. Hayes interrupted her with unexpected firmness. Ms. Evans, with all due respect, these are the expressed wishes of a man who prepared all of this years in advance and in complete legality. The boy has the right to see what his grandfather left for him. Any attempt to prevent this would be considered obstruction of justice. Henry was visibly sweating. Perhaps we should just give them some privacy. No, Victoria was categorical. As the bank's legal representative, I have the right to observe any procedure that occurs on these premises, especially considering the sensitive nature of this situation. Mr. Hayes nodded. Very well. Then we shall all watch together. He took the flash drive and looked for a computer in the room. There was one, old but functional, in a corner. It took a few minutes to set it up and connect the device. Finally, the screen flickered, and the image of Professor Arthur appeared. He was sitting in a simple chair, with a white wall in the background. His glasses were in their usual place, hanging from his neck on a chain, and he wore a light blue button-down shirt. He looked tired, but his eyes held the intensity that everyone who knew him remembered. Hello, Ethan. The voice was clear, strong, full of life, despite what the image revealed about his physical condition. I don't know how old you are now as you watch this, but I hope you are old enough to understand what I'm about to say. My name is Arthur Davies, your grandfather, and this is my testimony. Sarah held Ethan's hand tightly. For years, I worked as an economics professor and financial consultant. I had the privilege of seeing from the inside how money moves in our society, how fortunes are made, and how often they are built on lies and injustice. For a long time, I closed my eyes to certain practices, not because I agreed with them, but out of fear of losing my job, my livelihood, my reputation. The professor paused as if gathering strength to continue. But there comes a time in life when we realize that silence is also a choice. And choices have consequences. Approximately 5 years ago, I discovered an elaborate money laundering scheme involving several shell companies, fraudulent international transactions, and the complicity of people in positions of power within the financial system. I will not name them all now, as the documents I have left contain evidence far more solid than words. Henry was pale. Victoria, for her part, maintained a neutral expression, but her fingers drummed nervously on her leather briefcase. I tried to report it through the proper channels. I presented evidence to the authorities, but the people involved have influence that goes beyond what I imagined. My reports were shelved. My contacts began to avoid me. I received veiled threats. It was then that I realized if I truly wanted to do something, I would have to be smarter. The image of the professor leaned slightly forward. So I began to save copies of everything. Every document, every suspicious transaction, every compromising communication. And I plan to leave this for you, Ethan, not as a burden, but as a choice. You can decide what to do with this information. You can hand it over to the authorities and trust that this time will be different. You can make it public and let society be the judge. Or you can simply keep it and live your life in peace. I will not judge you for any choice you make. Ethan felt the weight of those words. At only 11, he was being faced with a responsibility that many adults would refuse. But I want you to know one thing, my grandson. The money I left for you did not come from this scheme. Every penny was earned honestly, through my work as a professor and consultant. I checked and rechecked every account, every investment. Your inheritance is clean. It is the fruit of my sweat, my dedication, my honest work, and it is yours by right. The professor smiled for the first time in the video. Use it wisely. Use it for good. And always remember, wealth without integrity is just a beautiful illusion that crumbles in the first storm. I love you, Ethan, and wherever I am now, I will be proud of the man you will become. The screen went dark, and the silence in the room was almost palpable. Ethan had tears streaming down his face, but he didn't wipe them away. He stared at the dark screen, as if he could still see his grandfather there, as if he could ask questions and receive answers. Sarah pulled her son into a tight hug. I am so proud of you, and your grandfather is too. Mr. Hayes took the flash drive and stored it carefully. There are copies of this video stored in 3 different notary offices, as well as media sent to a trusted journalist with instructions to publish it if anything happens to the family. Professor Arthur thought of everything. Victoria had discreetly stepped away during the video and was speaking quietly on the phone. When she hung up, she turned to the group with an expression that tried to be professional but couldn't hide the tension. I believe we all need to reflect on what we've seen here. This material is extremely sensitive and could have serious legal implications. I suggest that nothing be removed from this room until we can have proper legal guidance. Mr. Hayes responded calmly, but firmly. The contents of this box legally belong to Ethan Davies. He has every right to take it with him. Any attempt to prevent that would be illegal confiscation. I'm not suggesting confiscation, merely caution. Sarah, who had remained quiet throughout the discussion, finally spoke, and her voice had a strength that surprised even herself. My son will take what is his. He will take every document, every piece of evidence his grandfather gathered, and we will decide together what to do with it. But not today. Today has been enough. Ethan agreed, carefully placing everything back in the box. When he finished, he grabbed the handle and lifted it. It was heavy, but he could carry it. As they prepared to leave, Celia entered the room again. May I have a word with you in private? Victoria was about to protest, but Mr. Hayes silenced her with a look. Celia led Sarah and Ethan to a corner of the room and spoke softly, but with urgency. Professor Arthur asked me to warn you about something. He said that when the box was opened, there would be reactions. People would try to stop you, intimidate you, or even make offers. He said not to trust anyone from the bank except me, and he said to get out of here as quickly as possible and go to a safe place. Sarah felt a chill. Do you think we're in danger? Celia hesitated. I don't know. But the professor was a careful man. If he thought it necessary to give me this message, there must be a reason. Ethan looked at his mother. Mum, I think we should listen to what she's saying. Sarah nodded. All right, let's go now. They returned to the group. Mr. Hayes, can we leave through an eve through? Alternate exit. The lawyer understood immediately. Yes, I believe that would be prudent. Victoria blocked their path. You can't just leave like this. There are procedures, documentation to be signed. All necessary documentation was already signed when we entered, Mr. Hayes retorted. There is no legal basis to detain them here. Henry, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Let them go, Victoria. We've caused enough trouble for one day. Victoria looked around, realizing she was losing control of the situation. Very well, but this isn't over. There are still legal issues to be resolved regarding the inheritance, the implicit accusations. In the material about everything, Celia guided the group through a different corridor, using passages that only old employees knew. They reached a side exit of the bank, which opened onto a less busy street. Stay safe, and if you need anything, my number is here. She handed a card to Sarah. When they finally left the bank, the sunlight peeking through the clouds seemed brighter than ever. Ethan held the box firmly, aware that he was carrying something much bigger than himself. Sarah pulled her phone from her pocket, a simple old device, and called the only number she thought could help them at that moment. On the other end of the line, a male voice answered, and Sarah felt tears return to her eyes as she recognized it. Robert? Robert, is that really you? I need your help. It's about Ethan, and about your father. The man on the other end was silent for a moment that felt like an eternity. Finally, he replied, Sarah, thank God. I thought this day would never come. Where are you? I'll come get you now. And as they waited on the corner of that busy downtown Chicago street, Ethan and Sarah didn't know that the day that had begun with so much apprehension was only just beginning to reveal all its secrets. Robert arrived 40 minutes later, driving a simple car that had seen better days. When he got out, Sarah felt as if time had stopped for a moment. He was different, thinner, with wrinkles around his eyes that hadn't been there when he disappeared. His hair had grey strands at the temples, and there was a small scar above his left eyebrow. But it was him. It was the man she had loved, the father of her son. The man who had left without explanation almost a decade ago. Ethan, who was only 2 when his father vanished, had no conscious memories of him. Only the stories his mother told, the old photos they kept in a worn-out album, and a vague sense of absence that had always hung over his life like an invisible shadow. Now facing this man who was both a stranger and an essential part of his story, Ethan didn't know what to feel. Robert approached slowly, as if fearing any sudden movement might make Sarah and Ethan disappear. Hi, his voice was hoarse, thick, with emotion. I'm sorry for everything. Sarah wanted to be angry. She wanted to scream, to ask where he had been all those years, why he had abandoned his family without even a word of goodbye. But looking at him, she saw only a man broken by his own choices, someone who clearly carried a burden too heavy to bear. Let's talk in the car. It's not safe to stay here. Robert looked around, his eyes trained to spot threats, like someone who had spent years looking over his shoulder. They got into the car, Ethan in the back seat holding tightly to his grandfather's box, Sarah in the front, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional one. Robert drove in silence for a few minutes, making seemingly random turns, checking the rearview mirror to see if they were being followed. Sarah noticed the gestures and felt a chill run down her spine. Robert, what's going on? Where have you been? He sighed deeply. It's a long story, and a complicated one, but you deserve to know the truth. I need you to let me explain everything before you judge me. Can you do that? Ethan spoke for the first time. You're my father. The statement was simple but loaded with years of questions. Robert looked in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting his son's. I am, and I know I don't deserve that title after everything, but I am, and I've always loved you even from a distance. They arrived at a small apartment in a distant neighborhood in Hyde Park. It was modest, clean, but had a temporary feel, as if Robert were always ready to leave again. There were few personal items, no decorations, just the essentials. The windows had heavy curtains that completely blocked the view from outside. Robert locked the door with 2 deadbolts and asked them to sit. He made coffee, a habit Sarah remembered, and then finally began to tell his story. When I disappeared 9 years ago, it wasn't because I wanted to abandon you. It was because I discovered something that put our lives in danger. Your father, Sarah, Professor Arthur, had contacted me a few weeks before. He was investigating a big financial scheme, much bigger than he initially thought. And at the time I was working as an internal auditor at one of the companies involved. Sarah's eyes widened. You knew? You knew what my father was doing? Robert nodded. Not only did I know, I was helping him. He showed me the first pieces of evidence and asked for my help to get internal documents from the company. I was naive, Sarah. I thought we could just gather the proof and hand it over to the authorities, and that everything would be resolved within the law. But Professor Arthur was more realistic. He knew the people involved had too much power. Ethan listened intently, beginning to understand the scale of what his grandfather had faced. I managed to get some important documents, proof of transactions, compromising emails, meeting records, but I was found out. One night coming home from work, I realized I was being followed. It was 2 men in a black car. They weren't police. They were something much worse. People hired to make sure certain things stayed secret. Sarah put a hand to her mouth. My God. I called Professor Arthur, desperate. He told me not to come home, that you would be in danger if I showed up. He told me he had a plan, but that I would need to disappear for a while. I trusted him. He was the wisest man I ever knew. So I disappeared, changed my name, my appearance, lived like a ghost all these years. And now? Why did you come back now? Sarah asked, her voice wavering between anger and relief. Because Professor Arthur left instructions with his lawyer, instructions that included notifying me when Ethan went to the bank. He knew that opening the safe deposit box would cause a reaction, and he wanted me to be here to protect you. I got a call from Mr. Hayes last night. He told me it was time to come back, that the professor's plan was finally coming to fruition. Ethan looked at the box he was holding. So my grandfather planned all of this? He knew my dad was alive? Robert smiled sadly. Your grandfather was a chess master, Ethan, always thinking 5-10 moves ahead. He not only knew I was alive, but he helped me financially over the years, secretly, so I could survive while in hiding. Every move he made had a purpose. Sarah felt tears stream down her face. All these years thinking you abandoned us. I didn't abandon you. I chose the only way I saw to keep you safe, and it was the hardest decision of my life. Robert reached out to touch Sarah's hand, but she pulled it away. He understood. He didn't expect immediate forgiveness. Robert's phone rang. He checked the number and his face grew serious. It's Mr. Hayes. He put it on speaker. Hello? Robert, are you safe? The lawyer's voice sounded worried. We are. What happened? I just received a call from a contact at the courthouse. Someone has filed a motion to challenge Sarah's guardianship over Ethan, claiming she is unfit to manage the inheritance. It's a maneuver to buy time and possibly take control of the boy's assets. Sarah stood up, indignant. How can they do that? I'm his mother. It's a common tactic when there's a lot of money involved, Mr. Hayes explained. But don't worry, I'm already preparing the defense. Also, there's something else. A journalist contacted me, Frank Miller. He used to cover Professor Arthur's classes for years and was investigating the case on his own. He says he has information that could help. Ethan remembered what his grandfather had said in the video about a trusted journalist. It's him. Grandpa mentioned a journalist who had copies of the material. Exactly, Mr. Hayes confirmed. Frank wants to meet with you, but you need to be careful. The bank must already be aware that the box was opened, and the people involved in the scheme will be too. While the conversation continued in another part of the city, in a meeting room overlooking Michigan Avenue, Victoria Evans was meeting with 3 men in suits. They were successful businessmen with names known in the city's financial circles, and they all had a lot to lose if the material left by Professor Arthur became public. The oldest of the group, Edward Martin, tapped his fingers nervously on the table. How did you let this happen? I thought the bank had everything under control. Victoria maintained her composure. There was no way to legally stop them. The boy had all the necessary documentation, and the professor's lawyer prepared everything perfectly, but there are ways to mitigate the damage. What ways? Another businessman, Charles Andrews, asked impatiently. First, the guardianship challenge we filed will force them to spend time and resources on lawyers. That gives us time to act. Second, I have contacts in the media who can plant doubts about the material's credibility. We'll suggest the professor was senile in his final years, that the accusations are baseless, that it's all an attempt to blackmail successful people. And what if the material gets to the press anyway? The third man, Roger Campbell, questioned. Victoria smiled, but it was a cold smile. Then we'll make sure their story is so questioned that no one will take it seriously. A poor woman, a son, a father who disappeared and mysteriously returned. It's easy to create a narrative that they're trying to exploit the memory of an old professor to get rich. But Edward didn't seem convinced. I still think it's too risky. If this evidence is really solid... That's why we need to act fast, Victoria interrupted. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to control the situation. In Robert's apartment, the group discussed their next steps. Ethan had opened the box again and was examining the documents with curiosity. Even at his young age, he could understand that these papers represented something important. Mum, there are names in here, lots of names. Ethan pointed to a list. Businessmen, politicians, even some judges. Sarah took the list and felt the weight of responsibility. This is bigger than we imagined, Robert agreed. Professor Arthur was documenting a corruption network that stretched across various layers of society. It's not just about money laundering. It's about how the system was manipulated to benefit a few at the expense of many. Leo, the young intern from the bank, was at that moment in his small rented room, also examining information. After seeing Ethan and his mother leave the bank, he had discreetly made copies of some digital files related to Professor Arthur's account. He knew he was risking his job and possibly more, but something inside him, perhaps the idealism of youth or simply a sense of justice, wouldn't let him remain indifferent. He sent an anonymous email to the journalist Frank Miller, a name he had found in old articles about the professor. In the email, he attached some of the documents he had copied and wrote, "There's more going on at Continental Trust Bank than the public knows. Professor Arthur was right, and people are trying to cover it all up again." Frank received the email while in his home office, a makeshift room in his Old Town apartment, filled with books, newspaper clippings, and boards with notes connected by red strings like a conspiracy map. He was 52, with completely white hair and eyes that had seen many important stories forgotten by the mainstream press. When he read the email and opened the attachments, his heart raced. Finally. He finally had access to the material he had suspected existed since Professor Arthur's passing. He picked up the phone and called Mr. Hayes. "Walter, I need to meet with the professor's family today if possible. I've just received documents that corroborate everything he was saying." The meeting was set for that evening, in a discreet restaurant far from the city centre. Sarah was nervous, Robert constantly checked if they were being followed, and Ethan carried the box as if it were the most precious thing in the world. And in a way it was. Frank was waiting for them at a table in the back. He was a kind-looking man, with reading glasses hanging from his neck, and a worn briefcase by his side. When he saw them arrive, he stood up respectfully. "Sarah, Robert, Ethan, it's an honor to meet you, Professor. Arthur was a great friend of mine. I'm so sorry for everything you're going through." They sat down and Frank got straight to the point. "I know it must be hard to trust anyone right now, especially a journalist, but I want you to know I'm not here for a sensational story. I'm here because I believe your grandfather was right, Ethan, and because I believe the truth needs to come out." Ethan looked at the journalist. "You knew my grandfather?" "I did. He taught classes that I audited at the university. I was always fascinated by how he could explain complex economic concepts so simply. But what really impressed me was his courage. When he started questioning suspicious financial practices, many of his colleagues distanced themselves. But he didn't give up, and he paid a high price for it." "How?" Ethan asked, wanting to understand more about the man who was his grandfather. Frank sighed. "He lost important positions at the university, had articles censored, was academically isolated. But the worst part was seeing people he considered friends turn their backs on him out of fear of being associated with him. In the end, he was practically alone. In his fight, Sarah wiped away a tear. My father never told me all that. He always tried to protect me. And he continued to protect you, even after he was gone. Frank opened his briefcase. I received an email today with documents from the bank that confirm suspicious transactions, but I need the complete material that the professor left for you. With that, I can write a series of reports that will shake not just the financial system of Chicago, but the entire country. Robert leaned forward. And that will put us in even greater danger. Possibly. Frank didn't lie. That's why we need to do this the right way. We can't just publish everything at once. We have to be strategic, create a narrative that's impossible to ignore, and ensure legal and physical protection for you. How? Sarah asked. First, we'll make everything public at once. Once the information is out there will be no containing it. We'll send copies to multiple media outlets, to authorities, to human rights organizations. Second, we'll make sure you have protection. I know a public prosecutor who is incorruptible. He can help. Ethan, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. My grandfather said in the video that the choice was mine, that I could decide what to do with the evidence. Everyone looked at the boy. I want the truth to be revealed, not because I want revenge or because I want to be famous, but because my grandfather spent the last years of his life fighting for this, and it wouldn't be fair to let everything he did be for nothing. Sarah held her son's hand, proud. Frank smiled. Your grandfather chose his heir well, Ethan. Not just of his fortune, but of his values. Robert placed his hand over Sarah's and Ethan's. Then it's decided. We're going to do this, but we're going to do it right. In the following days, an intense flurry of activity began. Frank worked tirelessly, analyzing every document, verifying every piece of information, building a solid and irrefutable journalistic narrative. Leo, the intern, continued to send anonymous information, taking greater risks each time he accessed systems he shouldn't have. Celia, the bank's security guard, also became a secret ally. She managed to copy entry and exit logs from the safe deposit box sector, proving that several people had tried to improperly access Professor Arthur's box in previous years. It was more proof that there was something valuable that others wanted to hide. Sarah went back to work, but now with Robert by her side, slowly rebuilding the trust that had been broken by years of absence. They talked for long hours about the past, about the choices made, about regrets and hopes. Ethan watched his parents reconnect and, for the first time in his life, felt he had a complete family. But the peace was fragile. Victoria and the businessmen were not idle. They hired private investigators to follow the family, tried to bribe people close to them, and began a subtle media campaign planting doubts about Professor Arthur's sanity in his final years. One night, Robert received an anonymous call. A distorted voice made him an offer. $5 million in exchange for all the documents and a promise to never speak of the matter again. It was a sum that would completely change their lives. They could live comfortably, give Ethan the best education, forget this whole struggle. Robert hung up without answering, but the temptation had planted a seed of doubt. He talked about it with Sarah that night, after Ethan was asleep. $5 million, Sarah. It's more than we could earn in 10 lifetimes of work. Sarah looked at her husband with tired eyes. And what is my father's memory worth? What is it worth to teach our son that doing the right thing is more important than money? If we accept this, Robert, we'll be selling ourselves out, and we'll never be able to look in the mirror again without feeling ashamed. Robert knew she was right, but the fear was real. These people had shown they were capable of anything, and he had a family to protect. The next day, Mr. Hayes received worrying news. The guardianship challenge had been fast-tracked, and a hearing was scheduled for the following week. It was a maneuver to force a quick decision before they could adequately prepare. This is obviously orchestrated, the lawyer explained, but it's also an opportunity. If we can present the material at the hearing, before a judge, it will be officially on the record. They won't be able to just make it disappear. Frank agreed. And I'll publish the first part of the report on the same day as the hearing. That way, even if they try to interfere with the judicial process, the information will already be public. Ethan, sitting in a corner of the room where they all gathered, was drawing in a notebook. They were simple drawings of a family together, of an older man smiling, of a large building with people leaving it. It was his way of processing everything that was happening. Sarah approached her son. "How are you feeling, my love?" Ethan stopped drawing and looked at his mother. "Scared, but also hopeful. I think that's what Grandpa wanted. For us not to give up even when we're scared." She hugged her son, feeling the weight of the responsibility of raising him amidst all this turmoil. But she also felt pride in seeing that, despite being so young, Ethan was developing an inner strength that many adults never find. The night wore on, and everyone knew the coming days would be decisive. The pieces on the chessboard that Professor Arthur had so carefully set were moving into their final positions, and checkmate was near. But there were still many moves to be made, and the outcome was not guaranteed. Across the city, Henry Thompson was in his office late at night, staring at papers scattered across his desk. His conscience was heavy. He wasn't a bad man by nature, just someone who had made questionable choices over the years, choices driven by fear and ambition. But now, seeing an 11-year-old boy fight for his grandfather's memory, he was forced to confront what he had become. He picked up the phone and made a call he knew would change everything. "Mr. Hayes, this is Henry Thompson from Continental Trust Bank. I need to speak with you. I have information that could help young Ethan's case." The morning of the hearing dawned with a clear sky over Chicago, as if even the weather knew something important was about to happen. Sarah woke up before sunrise, unable to sleep with the anxiety gripping her chest. She looked at Ethan, sleeping peacefully on the sofa bed in Robert's apartment, and felt a mixture of pride and fear. Her son was about to face something no child should have to face. Robert was already awake, making coffee. Living together for the past few days had brought to the surface feelings they both thought they had buried long ago. It was no longer the passionate love of their youth, but something deeper, built on shared wounds and the common responsibility of protecting Ethan. "Did you sleep?" Sarah asked softly. "A few hours." Robert poured the coffee. "I'm nervous. Not just about the hearing, but about what might happen after." Sarah understood. Once the material was presented publicly, there would be no going back. "Will we be safe after all of this?" "Mr. Hayes assured me we will. Frank has also taken precautions. Copies of the material are in several secure locations. If something happens to us, everything will be released automatically." It was a comforting and terrifying thought at the same time. The idea that they needed a contingency plan in case they were harmed showed the gravity of the situation. Ethan woke up shortly after, already wearing the same dress clothes he had worn to the bank. Sarah had washed and ironed them carefully, trying to make her son look his best for the court. He ate breakfast in silence, processing everything that was about to happen. "Son, are you sure about this?" Sarah asked one last time. "We can still back out. We can take the money your grandfather left and start over somewhere else far." From all this, Ethan looked at his mother with those eyes that so resembled his grandfather's. "Mom, if we give up now, everything Grandpa did will mean nothing, and all the bad people will keep doing bad things. We can't let that happen." Robert put a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan. More than you can imagine." The criminal courts building was in the Loop, an imposing building full of history. Mr. Hayes was waiting for them on the steps, accompanied by Frank, who carried his camera and a recorder. The journalist had arranged for other press colleagues to be present, ensuring everything would be documented. Inside the courthouse, the hearing room was typical: dark wood, uncomfortable seats, an atmosphere heavy with institutional tension. On the other side, Victoria and a lawyer hired by the businessman were already there. A man named Augustus Fisher, known for winning impossible cases using any means necessary. The judge presiding over the hearing was Judge Helen Roberts, a 60-year-old woman with a reputation for being strict but fair. She entered the room in her black robe and everyone rose in respect. As she sat, she adjusted her glasses and looked at everyone present with an unreadable expression. "Good morning, everyone. We are here to deliberate on the petition challenging the guardianship of the minor Ethan Davies. Mr. Fisher, you may present the plaintiff's arguments." Augustus rose with calculated movements. "Your Honor, our petition questions Mrs. Sarah Davies's ability to properly manage the substantial inheritance left to her minor son. The lady lives in precarious conditions, works multiple jobs, and has no training or experience in financial management. An inheritance of nearly $3 million requires professional supervision and possibly the appointment of a financial guardian." Mr. Hayes stood up. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this petition is a clear attempt to manipulate the legal system for ulterior motives. Mrs. Davies is a dedicated mother who raised her son in adverse conditions precisely because she was abandoned by the system that now tries to take from her the few rights she has. Furthermore, there are far more serious issues at stake here, which need to be brought to light in this court." The judge raised an eyebrow. "What issues would those be, Mr. Hayes?" "Your Honor, Professor Arthur Davies, the minor's grandfather, spent the last years of his life documenting a financial corruption scheme involving several public figures and respected institutions. This material was left to his grandson, and we believe the true motivation of this guardianship petition is to prevent this information from becoming public." Augustus quickly interrupted. "That is an absurd and baseless accusation. We are here to discuss the well-being of a child, not the conspiracy theories of an old man who, as everyone knows, was in mental decline in his final years." Mr. Hayes remained calm. "If you please, Your Honor, I would like to present evidence that proves not only Professor Arthur's sanity, but also the veracity of his claims." The judge thought for a moment. "Very well, you may present it." Mr. Hayes nodded to Frank, who began distributing copies of documents to the judge, the opposing counsel, and the public prosecutor, who had joined the hearing representing the state's interests. The papers contained bank transactions, fraudulent contracts, compromising emails, and a detailed timeline of the scheme. The judge examined the documents in silence for several minutes. Her expression gradually changed from skepticism to seriousness. "Are these documents authentic?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Hayes confirmed. "We have the originals, all notarized. In addition, we have a video recorded by Professor Arthur explaining the entire situation." Ethan stood up, surprising everyone. "Excuse me, Your Honor. May I speak?" The judge looked at the boy with curiosity. "You are Ethan?" "Yes, ma'am." "You may speak, young man." Ethan took a deep breath. "I know I'm just a kid, but my grandfather left all this for me because he trusted me to do the right thing. He wasn't crazy. He was trying to do what was just. And I want to continue what he started. Not for the money, but because it's the right thing to do." A heavy silence filled the room. The judge looked at the boy with an expression that mixed surprise and respect. Augustus tried to regain control. "Your Honor, this is precisely why the guardianship must be questioned. The boy is being influenced and manipulated to—" "Silence, Mr. Fisher," the judge interrupted firmly. She then turned her attention to Ethan. "Young man, do you understand that what you are proposing could have serious consequences for you and your family?" "I do, but my grandfather taught me, even without being here, that some things are more important than our own safety." "The truth is one of those things." The judge nodded slowly. "I will need time to examine all this material carefully, but I must say, I am impressed with the organization and apparent authenticity of these documents. I will suspend this hearing for 2 hours while I review everything. When we return, I will give my decision." During the break, Victoria was visibly nervous, making several calls. Augustus tried to find a legal loophole, but knew he was losing. Outside the courtroom, Sarah hugged Ethan tightly. "You were incredible in there. I have no words to say how proud I am." Robert joined the hug. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you right now, son." Frank used the break to call his newsroom. The first report would be published at that exact moment, simultaneously across several media outlets. The timing was perfect. While the justice system analyzed the evidence, the public would also have access to it. In less than an hour, social media was buzzing. The story of the boy facing the financial system to honor his grandfather spread rapidly. Hashtags like Chan Justice for Ethan and Punch the Professor's Truth began trending. Public pressure was building. When the hearing resumed, Judge Roberts had a grave expression. After carefully examining all the material presented, I have reached some conclusions. First, I completely reject the petition challenging guardianship. Mrs. Davies has shown herself to be a dedicated and capable mother, and there is no evidence that she is unfit to manage her son's assets. Second, the documents presented by Mr. Hayes are, at first glance, extremely concerning and merit an official investigation. She turned to the public prosecutor. Mr. Clark, I expect the District Attorney's Office to take the appropriate measures to investigate the allegations contained in these documents. The prosecutor nodded. Certainly, Your Honor, I have already initiated the preliminary procedures. The judge then looked at Ethan. Young Ethan, you have demonstrated a maturity and courage today that many adults lack. But I must warn you, the path you have chosen will not be easy. There will be challenges, pressures, perhaps even threats. Are you sure you want to continue? Ethan did not hesitate. I'm sure. Very well. Then I declare this hearing adjourned. Guardianship remains with the mother. The documents will be officially recognized by this court and forwarded to the competent authorities, and I order that adequate protection be provided to the family until the investigations are concluded. When they left the courthouse, they were greeted by a crowd of journalists and ordinary people who had followed the story on social media. Camera flashes went off, questions were shouted, but Sarah and Robert shielded Ethan, clearing a path to the car. In the following days, the story gained national attention. The material left by Professor Arthur proved to be even more comprehensive than imagined. It not only documented the money laundering scheme, but also revealed connections to other financial crimes, tax fraud and corruption at various levels. Henry Thompson, who had decided to cooperate, provided additional information about the bank's internal operations. His decision to switch sides cost him his job and his reputation in the financial world, but he told the press he could finally sleep at night. Leo, the intern, also came forward publicly as the source who had leaked internal bank documents. He was fired immediately, but several job offers from financial transparency organizations came his way. His courage inspired other employees to report irregularities in their own institutions. Victoria and the 3 businessmen were indicted. The investigations revealed not only the money laundering scheme, but also attempts to obstruct justice, bribe, officials and other crimes. The trial would be long and complex, but the evidence was solid. Celia, the bank's security guard, was promoted to head of security at a company that valued ethics. She visited Ethan and Sarah frequently, becoming like a grandmother to the boy. Edward, Charles and Roger, the businessmen involved, saw their empires crumble. Companies were investigated, accounts were frozen, reputations were destroyed. It was the beginning of a necessary, albeit late, cleanup in the financial system. 3 months after the hearing, Ethan stood on the plot of land where the Professor Arthur Davies Institute would be built, a school dedicated to teaching financial literacy and ethics to children and youth from underprivileged communities. The project would be funded with part of the inheritance under the supervision of a board composed of Sarah, Robert, Mr. Hayes, and Frank. The boy wore the small golden key from the safe deposit box around his neck, which had become a symbol, not a symbol of wealth, but of responsibility and courage. Beside him, Sarah and Robert watched proudly. They had decided to give their relationship another chance, slowly building on the ashes of the past. Frank had published a series of 12 investigative reports that resulted in a National Journalism Award. But for him, the real prize was seeing justice served and Professor Arthur's memory honored. Mr. Hayes, now 83, remained active, overseeing all legal aspects of the inheritance and the institute. He said it was his last great case, and he wanted to ensure it was concluded perfectly. Construction of the institute would begin in a week. It would be a simple but functional building with equipped classrooms, a library, a computer lab, and an auditorium. In the entrance hall, there would be a statue of Professor Arthur, not as an imposing figure, but as a seated teacher with a book in his hands always ready to teach. Ethan had decided that most of the inheritance would be kept in trust until he came of age, as his grandfather had suggested. He would receive a modest allowance, enough for his needs but not so much that it would detach him from reality. Sarah had returned to school, taking an administration course at night, determined to be able to help her son manage the assets in the future. Robert had found a job as a compliance consultant at a tech company. His years of experience observing fraud from the inside made him valuable to companies that genuinely wanted to operate within the law. He didn't earn as much as in the past, but he slept better at night. The trial of those involved in the scheme was set for the following year. The media continued to cover the case, and the term the Professor Arthur Law began to be used to refer to a proposal for stricter legislation against white-collar financial crimes. On a Saturday afternoon, Ethan was at home doing homework when he found among his school books an old photo of his grandfather. It was a simple photo taken at the university, showing Professor Arthur in front of a blackboard full of economic equations. But what caught the eye was his smile, genuine and full of life. Ethan took the photo and placed it on his bedside table. "Thank you, Grandpa, for everything," he whispered to the image. That night, the family had dinner together for the first time in a long time. Sarah had baked a simple cake, Robert brought pizza, and they ate while talking about things both trivial and important. They talked about how school was going for Ethan, about the plans for the institute, about the changes that had happened in their lives. Sarah looked at Robert and Ethan and felt a deep gratitude, not for the wealth they now had, but for having found each other again as a family. The scars of the past were still there, but they were healing, and in the healing process, they were becoming stronger. Ethan went to sleep that night with the golden key around his neck and the photo of his grandfather on his bedside table. He dreamed he was in a classroom and Professor Arthur was teaching, but instead of economics, he was teaching about courage, about doing what is right even when it's hard, about leaving the world better than we found it. In the dream, the professor looked at Ethan and smiled. "You understand, my grandson. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about showing that one person can make a difference, that truth can win, that good can triumph." When Ethan woke up on Sunday morning, the sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the room. He got up and went to the window, looking out at the city that stretched before him. It was the same Chicago as always, chaotic and vibrant, full of inequality and injustice, but also full of possibilities. Robert entered the room. "Good morning, champ. Sleep well?" "I did. I dreamed about Grandpa." "Really, and what did he say?" Ethan smiled. "He said I'm on the right path." Robert hugged his son. "Your grandfather was a very wise man, and he was right." Months turned into years. The Professor Arthur Institute opened its doors and quickly became a benchmark in financial education for young people. Hundreds of children passed through its classrooms, learning not only about money but about ethics, responsibility, and citizenship. Ethan grew up, always maintaining the humility his mother taught him and the courage his grandfather inspired. At 18, when he finally gained full access to the inheritance, his first action was to expand the institute, creating a network of schools in several cities across the country. The trial of those involved in the scheme resulted in convictions ranging from 8 to 15 years in prison. Victoria lost her license to practice law. The three businessmen lost most of their assets, which were seized by the state. Continental Trust Bank underwent a complete restructuring, with new leadership and strict compliance policies. Frank continued his journalistic work, but always kept in close contact with the family. He wrote a book about the case, titled The Professor's Inheritance, which became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary series. Sarah graduated with a degree in administration and began managing the institute's operations. She discovered she had a talent for management and a passion for education she never knew she had. Robert continued his work in compliance, but also volunteered his time at the institute, teaching young people about the dangers of financial corruption. Leo, the former intern, became a lawyer specializing in corporate whistleblowing cases, known as a protector of whistleblowers. His story of courage inspired many others to report unethical practices. Celia retired at 70, but continued to visit the institute weekly, where she told stories about Professor Arthur to the children. Her narratives kept the memory of the man who started it all alive. In a special ceremony, 10 years after the opening of the safe deposit box, Ethan, now a young man of 21, placed a second letter in the special box that had been preserved, as a relic at the institute. In the letter, he wrote about how his grandfather's legacy had transformed not only his life, but the lives of thousands of people. "Dear Grandpa," Ethan wrote, 10 years have passed since that day at the bank. 10 years in which I learned that your true inheritance wasn't in the bank account or the documents in the box. It was in the values you lived and defended. Today, the institute that bears your name has already educated more than 5,000 young people. Each one of them has learned that doing what is right is more important than doing what is easy. That honesty is worth more than any fortune. That one person can indeed make a difference. He paused, wiping away a tear. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for teaching me that true wealth is not what we have, but what we do with what we have. Your legacy lives on, not in bronze or stone, but in every life we touch, in every truth we defend, in every time we choose the hard path because it is the right one. Sarah and Robert, now with grey hair but genuine smiles, watched their son write. They had overcome the ghosts of the past and built a life that, while not perfect, was filled with love, purpose, and dignity. Frank, now 62, photographed the moment for a new article. Ethan's story continued to inspire people, reminding everyone that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. As the sun set over Chicago, casting long shadows over the institute, Ethan looked at the statue of his grandfather in the entrance hall. The golden afternoon light illuminated the bronze figure, making it seem as if Professor Arthur were alive, ready to teach one more lesson. And perhaps he was, because true legacies do not die with people. They live on in every inspired action, in every brave choice, in every moment someone decides to do what is right, even when it is difficult. Ethan placed a hand over his heart, feeling the small golden key he still wore after all these years. It was no longer just a symbol of the box he had opened or the inheritance he had received. It was a constant reminder that each of us carries keys that can open doors to a better future. We just need the courage to use them. That night, walking home with his parents, Ethan looked up at the starry sky and smiled. He felt that somewhere, somehow, his grandfather Arthur was smiling back. Proud not of the money he had left, but of the man his grandson was becoming. And as they walked through the city's illuminated streets, the three of them knew they had learned the most important lesson of all, that the true value of life is not in what we accumulate, but in what we do for others. That wealth without purpose is empty, but purpose transforms any life into a fortune. The legacy of Professor Arthur Davies was not measured in dollars or cents, but in transformed lives, revealed truths, and the courage of a child who refused to let good be defeated by evil. And that legacy, like all true legacies, was eternal. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Ethan, Sarah, and Professor Arthur has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of courage, truth, and transformation, please leave a like right now, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories, and tell us in the comments which moment stood out to you the most. Was it Ethan's courage in facing the bank, Sarah's strength in protecting her son, or perhaps Professor Arthur's wisdom in planning everything so carefully? Every day, we bring intense and emotional stories like this one, which reveal the deepest and truest side of the human soul. Stories that make us reflect on our own values and choices. We eagerly await you in the next episode with another narrative that will stir your emotions. Until then, remember, the greatest wealth we can leave behind is not in bank accounts, but in the hearts we touch and the lives we transform.